1984, and I'm going to tip my hand here, is not against totalitarianism, it's against communism. And it really is about Stalin and Stalinist Russia. Well, let me say something about Orwell and his life. I'll step back a little bit and we'll talk about that. I mentioned last class that he was a student at Eton College, and his teacher, at least of French, was none other than Aldous Huxley. Let me say a little bit more about his history, though, so walk it back a little bit. He's born in 1903, status of a British gentleman. Father was an Englishman working in the civil service in India. And he himself lived as a British imperial official at one point. But as I say, he went to Eton. He served in Burma later on. But he lacked the means to live as an English gentleman. And didn't want to do desk jobs. I sympathize. I was similar when I graduated university. That was what a lot of people were doing. They go into the big corporations and start working, getting yourself a job. They pay better, but the job is always tedious, and at least at the entry level, for sure. He didn't want to do that. He wanted to be a writer, and he felt rather guilty about being part of the establishment. And so he did the equivalent in the 1920s of what they did in the 1960s. He became something of a hippie, a little bohemian. He lived in London and Paris in conditions of poverty. And he basically lived with people that would have been considered beneath his class. It's sort of interesting. So he identified with the political left. The political left, by this point, was becoming very much associated more and more strongly with communism. Because remember, in 1917, there is the Russian Revolution, happens during the First World War. Doesn't happen anywhere else. Doesn't happen in London, as Marx thought. Doesn't happen in America. Doesn't happen anywhere else in Europe. But it does happen in Russia, and in general, those who were sympathetic to the communists in the West were less extreme, perhaps, but still inclined towards Moscow. So he was a socialist, Eric Arthur Blair, or George Orwell as we know him. And he went in the 1930s to Spain, where there was a fascist government, and he fought against them in a war, Spanish Civil War. And he found himself, ironically, even though he was fighting against Franco and the fascists, fighting against those on his own side, as is often the case in the left. There are factions within this. And on his side are anarchists and syndicalists and communists who are fighting. They're hating each other as much as they're hating the Franco fascists. And Blair doesn't forget this. And I think the communists who are the best organized win out amongst the left. And gentlemen like Blair, who wants to work in a collaborative fashion, is rather disenchanted by this, and he brings this back to England with him, because even though the communists win in amongst the left, Blair does not feel comfortable being on the left. And so he goes back to Britain. He works in the BBC for a little while, finds that tedious as well. But he carries on a private literary war with the communists, in my opinion, and writes about it here in 1984. 1984, and I'm going to tip my hand here, is not against totalitarianism, it's against communism. And it really is about Stalin and Stalinist Russia. And I would say the same thing is true of his Animal Farm. It's not against totalitarian government in general, although you can see that things that are said about the communists will apply to all totalitarian governments. But it is specifically against that, and Big Brother with the big mustache looks a lot like Joseph Stalin. As I say, when later writers come along, depending on their political perspective, they're going to want to identify that with their political opponent and say this is like 1984, they're totalitarian, Big Brother, they're intrusive, they crack down on civil liberties, that sort of thing. But I think it's pretty clear from Orwell's own biography that he intends it to apply to the political left. You will rarely hear that in academia because academia tends to be dominated by those who are sympathetic with the political left. And the warning they rather selectively want to see applies to one side, not their own. And I think it can apply to both sides. But I don't think that's Orwell's intention. At any rate,